Good morning. Welcome to the Connect West Virginia training series, week 5. We are going to go ahead and post the sign-in link in the chat box right now as you're signing in, so you can go ahead and click on that and start getting yourself signed in. We're just going to give about a minute for everybody to roll in for the webinar. If you want to let us know what county you're signing in from so we have an idea where you guys are located while we give it a minute, feel free to. You're going to notice there is a chat box and a question and answer box. So keep the question and answer box for questions that our presenter will answer in the end, and any questions you have related to sign-in or evaluations in the chat box. But feel free to let us know where you're from. We're going to give about a minute for people to sign in, and then we'll get started. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome. Again, the sign-in sheet has been put in the chat box. So while we give another half a minute for people to sign in, feel free to go ahead and click on that link and get yourself signed in. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. You see people from all over the state. This is exciting. Okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. Once again, welcome to the Connect West Virginia training series. My name is Melody Osborne. I serve as the Adolescent Health Initiative Coordinator for the Northern Panhandle of West Virginia. I'm your moderator for today. Like I said earlier, this is our 5th week in the training series, so we welcome you today. This was a project that was put together by funding through a grant through the Department of Health and Human Resources, and was planned in collaboration between West Virginia Adolescent Health Initiative, FRIZ, West Virginia Free, and the West Virginia Center for Children's Justice. I do want to take a moment to thank the West Virginia Center for Children's Justice for sponsoring the CEUs for today. You will be receiving, if you need them, 1.25 contact hours in social work, counseling, law enforcement, nursing, domestic violence advocates, and addiction specialists. Lisa Carmelia has taken the lead in assisting with CEUs, and her email address will be provided to you in the chat box. So if you have any questions pertaining to CEUs, please feel free to contact her and let her know. You're welcome to reach out to me as well. Again, we're going to have a chat box that can answer questions related to CEUs and evaluation, but there is also a question and answer box. So if you have questions or that you would like to ask the presenter towards the end of the session, feel free to put those in there and we will ask him those questions in the end. If you're watching this webinar in connection with the graduate credit course, Selena Vickers will be on at the end of this webinar to go over this week's follow-up assignments and to answer any questions that you may have. So please wait until the end to address any graduate questions that you may have. Each week we are video recording these trainings and they are available on the FRIZ YouTube page. That link will be provided to you in the chat box as well. As with every week, my reminder is if you need CEUs in any of the disciplines that I mentioned, please make sure that you get your name on both the sign-in sheet and the evaluation. The evaluation link will be provided in the chat box, and it will also be emailed to you following this session. If you have any troubles with either one of them, don't worry, we're happy to help you. We want to make sure that you can focus on the presentation today. So just know if you have troubles opening the link, we're happy to help you afterwards. But we do need to make sure for those of you who need CEUs that you're on the sign-in sheet and you're on the evaluation sheet as well. Evaluation link, again, will be emailed to you. You're also going to receive an email of a certificate of attendance. So even if you are not needing CEUs today, you will still get a certificate of attendance. Everybody will for today. So if you need to hang on to that for a supervisor or keep it in your files, you'll be able to do that as well. Question and answers. Our presenter today will be taking questions towards the end of the presentation. So if you have questions that arise while you're listening, please feel free to put those in the question and answer box, and we will ask him those at the end. All lines will be muted for those of you who are attendees, so just know that your lines will be muted. In a moment, I will hand it over to our presenter.
Advocates and educators and children across the state. So wonderful to be here. The topic today is When the Child Trusts You, Understanding and Responding to Child Abuse Disclosures. So let's dive on in. A couple disclaimers. I'm an attorney, so naturally I'm going to include disclaimers. Always talk to your local attorney or prosecutor. We present at Zero Abuse Project training to individuals all over the nation, and so certainly laws vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but as we in West Virginia know, they can vary, rules and procedures can vary greatly county to county. So always talk to your local experts and don't take anything I say as gospel necessarily. Also credit to Victor Veith. Many of you know him and the Zero Abuse Project team. If anything strikes you as particularly insightful or helpful, it probably came from Victor or one of our talented team members. So grateful to work with all of them. This is something I stole from Jerry Seitz, a great trainer with the Southern Regional Child Advocacy Center. She begins her presentations with this by just drawing 2 quick columns on a piece of paper, or you can do it on a computer if you have that in front of you. As we talk about things and you hear something that's new to you or different and maybe potentially useful, jot that down in a quick column under ideas, and then before you jump onto your next Zoom call or maybe step outside for a little bit, make sure you jot on the right column how you could maybe apply that to your work, because obviously the goal is for you to take something today that you can use practically, and we certainly want this to be useful training for you. Our agenda for today. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on effects of trauma and the relevance, but I think we do need to at least talk about that a little bit when we're talking about how we respond to child abuse disclosures. You know, a child doesn't disclose abuse to you in a vacuum. There's a history that led the child to that point. There's a process that leads a child to that point. And you need to understand the context that the child lives in order to understand it and understand how to respond to it appropriately. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some potential consequences, talk a little bit through grooming dynamics. I think it's important to see things a little bit from the perpetrator perspective so you understand what the position the child's in when they come to you, a little bit about the dynamics of child abuse, what those implications are for interacting with child abuse victims, and then we're going to spend some time in application. So I know we're a little bit limited in our virtual context from an interaction standpoint, but I am going to direct you to the chat a few times throughout, and my wonderful colleagues will be monitoring the chat so we can have a bit of a dialogue as we go through this. Make sure you direct when I direct you to the chat, make sure you're clicking on the chat box, not the Q&A box. You're welcome to submit question and answer throughout as well, but we'll be holding all the question and answers until the end. So let's dive on in. First, on effects of trauma and the relevance. We want to be aware of what the indicators of abuse are, of course. And like I said, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these. These are indicators. This particular content is from Prevent Child Abuse West Virginia, a great organization here in the Mountain State. Of course, we're going to be alert to various injuries as indicators of potential physical abuse, right? Questionable fractures, questionable cuts. That bottom one on that left column under possible physical abuse, inconsistent explanations. That's key, right? I prosecuted a case in the Eastern Panhandle years ago where the perpetrator had crushed a child's face. She had squeezed her cheeks, and it was a bruise that went completely through the mouth. It was externally visible and internally visible. And the explanation for this, her explanation shifted. But it started out as, oh, well, it's just a spider bite, which didn't make any sense. It was a bilateral compression injury. And then after that, she said, oh, well, there's this freakishly strong 2-year-old that lives next door, and they play together sometimes. And there's this really flimsy hamper. Many of you have seen them just at Walmart, the flimsy white hampers. There's nothing solid to them at all. If you stepped on them, they just go flat. And so the perpetrator says, oh, well, this freakishly strong 2-year-old must have picked up this hamper and whacked my toddler daughter with it, and that explains this extreme bilateral compression injury. It's inconsistent, right? It doesn't make any sense, but those are that's certainly an indicator of physical abuse, and it definitely was in that case. There are various indicators of possible child neglect as well. Don't feel the need to frantically write all these down. We'll definitely make these slides available to you after the fact. Again, don't want to spend a ton of time here, but just put some of these on your radar. Possible sexual abuse. Of course, for younger children, if there's bloody diapers, things like that, difficulty walking or standing, we need to be aware of those indicators so we can engage with those children. Hostility or aggression. I think this is true in general of abuse indicators, but certainly with sexual abuse specifically, changes in demeanor. If you have an outgoing child who's suddenly reserved for an extended period of time, or vice versa. That can certainly be an indicator that something's problematic. Of course, you also hear the phrase, and it's true, it's also normal to be normal. Some children still do present very similarly, regardless of whether they're currently being victimized. We're also looking, I'd highlight the bottom one on this list as well, unusual sexual behavior or knowledge, idiosyncratic details. If children are talking about tastes and smells and things like that that they really shouldn't be able to articulate, then that's certainly an indication of unusual sexual behavior or knowledge. Even if they're interacting, the example is often given of a child who's placing dolls in sexual positions and mimicking sexual activity. That's certainly an indicator of unusual sexual behavior as well. We also need to be aware of emotional abuse. A lot of times we tend to put this in a lesser category when it comes to abuse and neglect, but it isn't. We know it can be every bit as devastating. And so we need to be aware of these possible indicators as well. A couple things to be aware of. I know we have at least one Darkness to Light affiliate with us today, probably others. There's some great resources out there by Darkness to Light. If you go to d2l.org, according to their statistics, only 38% of child sexual abuse victims do disclose, and only about a third of child sexual abuse cases are identified. They state only that only 19% of sexual abuse incidents result in arrest, and for each incarcerated rape offender, there are nearly 3 rape offenders under supervision in the community. There was a really great piece recently, and it came probably not all that recently. It came out about a year ago. But the title of this piece was, "Why Are We So Bad at Prosecuting Sexual Assault?" And the math that that piece went through illustrated that only about 1% of sexual assault prosecutions, or rather only about 1% of sexual assault cases result in a successful prosecution. There's a ton of barriers and there's a ton of systemic breakdowns that occur at any point. And one of the biggest ones is the inability of children to report abuse. And if they do report, more likely than not, they're often not believed. And then even if they do report, of course, there are many hurdles in investigation from an evidence collection standpoint, or just a belief, unfortunately, often by law enforcement. And then if it clears the law enforcement hurdle, it has to clear the prosecution hurdle. And then, of course, a jury has to find that evidence exists beyond a reasonable doubt. And then you have a judge, of course, at that point when you get to the sentencing phase. So there's a ton of hurdles. And I think many survivors, especially as they get older, are aware of those hurdles. And certainly that weighs against a child disclosing. There's a ton of factors weighing against a child disclosing. So if a child does disclose to you, we need to take that extremely seriously. That's a tremendous privilege, a tremendous responsibility. And your decision on how you respond to that child when that child trusts you, your decision has lifelong consequences for the child and potentially many others. So it's something we need to take very seriously, be prepared for, and train for in advance, as opposed to just dealing with it haphazardly in the moment. Let's talk very briefly about the effects of trauma. I'm going to play a quick clip from Diane Langberg. She's a leading psychologist, nationally known expert, and she'll talk about this very briefly for us.
When a child is marinated in trauma, a child is a developing person, and so they are malleable, which means they can be shaped. And if you are being shaped by untrustworthy people, violent people, humiliating people, abusive people, those who are full of rage, it distorts the development of the human being and also teaches them a tremendous number of lies about who they are and their value and what relationships look like, and leaves huge gaps in understanding things like what love actually is, what it means to speak truth, what it means to be safe.
Right. So as Diane said, this isn't just a one-time incident. This is something that is, as she said, children are malleable. and there can be long-term effects of this. I don't want to go too long into this. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of the studies on adverse childhood experiences, but for those of you who are not, it's been considered, I think accurately, the most important research in the history of medical science. It's been replicated. The findings of these studies have been replicated in hundreds of other studies. It can be summed up in this quote from one of the initial authors of the Adverse Childhood Experiences seminal study. Quote, "In the context of everyday medical practice, we came to recognize that the earliest years of infancy and childhood are not lost, but like a child's footprints in wet cement are often lifelong." And so we see that in a variety of ways. There are 10, and at least in this categorization, there are 10 unique adverse childhood experiences. So certainly emotional abuse. In this specific study, 11% of children experienced that in the form of humiliation or threats. Physical abuse, strikes hard enough to receive injuries, 28% of children. A contact sexual abuse, 28% of women, 16% of men, again in this study. Mother treated violently, so domestic violence in the home. Alcoholic household member, drug user, 27%, again in this study, and this is a bit dated, this is from 2010. A household member in prison, 6%. Household member chronically depressed, suicidal, mentally ill, psychiatric hospitalization, 17%. And then not raised by both biological parents, 23%, and then physical neglect, 10%. So these specific adverse childhood experiences were correlated to a variety of poor health or social outcomes. If you have just one of these, that dramatically increases your risk of a variety of issues that you might not think are intrinsically linked to childhood neglect or abuse or deprivation. So cancer, heart disease, STDs, liver disease, smoking, alcohol abuse, obesity, drug dependence, IV drug use, early intercourse and pregnancy. Wouldn't necessarily think that those would flow from those initial adverse childhood trauma, but study after study after study after study demonstrates that they do. And it's not just physical health related issues. It's also mental health related issues that are correlated to childhood trauma. Depression, anxiety disorders, hallucinations, sleep disturbances, memory disturbances, anger problems, domestic violence risks, job problems, issues with maintaining employment, relationship problems, psychiatric disorders, all linked to adverse childhood experiences that surface years later. We see that in a couple additional discrete categories. Substance abuse, something we certainly struggle with throughout the state. Female survivors of childhood abuse are 3 times more likely to engage in substance abuse. Male survivors are 2.6 times more likely to engage in substance abuse. On the mental health side, depression is twice as likely, suicidal attempts twice as likely. Female survivors are 3 times more likely to have psychiatric disorders. I was struck by this stat at the bottom of mental health. 70% of male survivors of abuse seek psychological treatment for suicidal ideations, attempts, and substance abuse. We also see a variety of obesity and eating disorders as a result of this as well. And of course, medical issues, as we already covered, it's not just the major medical issues that, like the ones we've discussed, it also can be more minor health issues. There's a correlation there as well. Irritable bowel syndrome and chronic headaches. Of course, we see crime correlation as well, twice as likely to be arrested for both property offenses and violent offenses. There was a leading scholar on this who comments that when we address these other social ills, so as we absolutely should, whether they be substance abuse or the health-related issues, oftentimes we're dealing with the smoke, not the fire. Oftentimes the fire, the underlying fire, was that childhood trauma. And so that to me suggests some things about resources and prioritization of childhood trauma. Especially in a state, like West Virginia, where I have this terrible substance abuse issues. I've seen some suggest that the pandemic is certainly not helping by any stretch of the imagination. With the scope of those social ills, we really need to remember the correlation that often, not always, but often exists to childhood trauma. And we need to be putting a lot of effort and resource into the prevention piece so we're not repeating this cycle for decades to come. I do want to point out, please don't take away an impression that simply because you're an abuse survivor or someone you know and love as an abuse survivor that they're necessarily, that this is their destiny necessarily. Survivors certainly can and do thrive in spite of all of the above. But as you can see, certainly there are many challenges. One of the things to point out is life expectancy. Again, robust literature supporting that adverse childhood experiences greatly negatively impact life expectancy. We see this in particular. Individuals with an ACE score of 6, so 6 or more childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences and higher, had a lifespan almost 2 decades shorter than those seen with an ACE score of 0, but otherwise similar characteristics. Almost 2 decades shorter, 6 or more. And what we need to remember is not that many people, well, rather quite a few people, the majority of individuals who have had an adverse childhood experiences have more than one. It's a minority of abuse survivors who've only experienced child maltreatment in one way. So we see this in the polyvictimization studies. They show that exposure to multiple forms of violence and victimization is common. In this specific study, almost 66% of the sample size was exposed to more than one type. 30% experienced 5 or more types. 10% experience 11 or more different forms. So as you can see, polyvictimization is more highly related to trauma symptoms than repeated victimizations of a single type. So certainly that raises serious implications. So we know that there's a significant impact, lifelong. Let's shift a bit to the perpetrator perspective so we can understand the child's context when they come to us with an abuse disclosure. This is a quote from a convicted child molester. This individual is quoted in a great book by Dr. Anna Salter, one of the leading researchers as well, called Predators. And the book's a bit old. It came out a few decades ago, but I think it still stands up well in terms of illustrating perpetrator dynamics, and it's also written at a lay level. So if you don't want to delve into a lot of the academic literature, it's written at a popular level where you can really grasp it and understand it. It is a dark read. It is going to ruin your week when you do read it, but I think it is important for us to understand the mindset of these individuals. So this particular individual says, quote, "Child molesters are very professional at what they do, and they do a good job at it. There's a ton of hubris." I saw this as a prosecutor. There's a ton of hubris with predators, especially those who sexually abuse children, which is more my niche expertise. For example, was prosecuting a perpetrator who, despite having an attorney who would make all these filings to the court, he decided that he would write a handwritten memorandum defending incest and why incest itself should be viewed as legal because incest is, quote, consensual. He wrote, and this was like a 5-6 page memorandum that he hand wrote. He signed it, with his signature and everything. And he was accused of sexually assaulting his daughter, and he was previously convicted of sexually assaulting another daughter. So you imagine just the hubris of an individual who would do that, despite currently being incarcerated on those types of charges. And yet they have a ton of hubris for a reason. They're very practiced, sexual predators specifically. They've gotten away with sexual abuse many, many times. I think a lot of times one of the misconceptions in this area is some view sexual predators, especially who have a lower IQ, is somehow less dangerous. And that's not true. The IQ studies show is fairly irrelevant. They're dangerous across an intellectual spectrum. They can still be very careful and very dangerous to children despite having a lower IQ in many, not all situations. So let's talk a little bit about what grooming is. Dictionary definition: building connection and gaining trust with or authority over a child in order to facilitate abuse. So what does that look like concretely? There's a couple different stages to it that we'll go through. The first stage is typically targeting. Just anecdotally for me in my caseload, very often you would see targeting of vulnerable families. So families where there was extensive CPS involvement. Maybe there wasn't a parent in the picture. Maybe they're being raised by grandparents or by some other relative. Oftentimes there wasn't a father figure in the picture. Typically these families would have some sort of criminal history. I say typically, certainly not always. Abuse certainly has impacts across all spectrums. But you would often see predators targeting families with substance abuse issues. Sometimes it depended on the offender. You sort of have two general categories of offenders, of sexual offenders specifically. You have more preferential offenders where they have a specific type that they're after, whether that be an age preference, a gender preference, or even a familial preference. And then you have more opportunistic offenders who will simply abuse when they have access to a child. So in those cases, you're looking at an existing relationship to a child, maybe often a family member, family friend, a coach, a teacher, often a pastor, things like that. We also see an exploiting of naivete of children in this targeting stage. They're looking for children who won't understand that this behavior is wrong and are therefore less likely to disclose. That's why, incidentally, it's so important that we talk about body safety, that we talk about what are appropriate and inappropriate touches so children can correctly identify what's appropriate and what's inappropriate behavior. I also want to note that this is an extended planning process. I've also prosecuted cases of child abuse that were perpetrated through the dark web, or that there was child sexual abuse material, videos and images produced and then shared on the dark web. And we might think that's something that occurs out there in some larger populace, but the first dark web case I was ever involved with was in Hampshire County, West Virginia. Certainly not a thriving metropolis, those who are familiar with it, and yet there was an offender in Hampshire County who was engaged in that. And in that specific website, there was a forum on that website. In addition to sharing horrific images and videos of child sexual abuse material, that community was also there were forums where they would trade ideas on how you could target children and groom children effectively. So they get a bit of peer input on the targeting stage as well. And then, of course, the next stage is befriending, similar interests, things like that. Often video games, things like that. If you have predators who are embedded within faith communities, we do know that predators do seek out faith communities. 93% of sexual predators self-identify as religious. Some have claimed that they do that because religious individuals, they claim that religious individuals are more naive, they're more trusting, more forgiving, and so they felt they could get away with sexual abuse better in those contexts. And so you'll see it with things like, oh, well, let's do life together, things like that. And obviously, that's a common phrase, and most of the time it's not malicious, but you will see those types of statements in the befriending phase and in faith communities specifically. Inordinate amount of time spent, certainly gift giving, fidget spinners, bikes, even things that are viewed as not maybe a huge deal depending on your socioeconomic, where you're at on the socioeconomic spectrum. For many of these kids, that's a huge deal. A bike is a huge deal, and so that can be a wedge in a way to initially establish that connection. After there's the befriending stage, then you get into isolation. The goal here is to make the child feel special, and there's also a lot of work done into isolating them from existing support systems. And that's important, right? Because if they're isolated, they're going to be less likely to be believed when they come forward, because they won't have as robust of a support system. So the goal is to increase dependence on the perpetrator. And then if they so that makes it more likely that they're going to disclose. If they do disclose, there's less existing relationships for them to rely on. And of course, there's a learning phase as well, where the perpetrator is discovering vulnerabilities. This is a fascinating documentary, Abducted in Plain Sight. In that specific documentary, a perpetrator focuses on gaps or issues within the parents' marriage, and he actually engages in sexual relationships with both parents, the father and the mother. And this was back in the 80s. He was able to compromise them a bit, and then he was able to abuse their daughter with impunity. So he learned about the vulnerabilities. It can be more generic than that. But again, the goal is to increase dependence on the perpetrator. There's the actual abusing itself. Again, this is typically perpetrated in contexts where they're most likely to get away with and most likely to be believed. So there's the marital counseling example where one couple talks about how an offender had encouraged them to share their most intimate issues and marital struggles with him. And then after they did that, he suggested they go and seek counseling. And then he offered, oh, well, I'll just provide childcare. You see it even sometimes in the perpetration, not just in creating opportunities for abuse, but you sometimes see that plausible deniability even in the perpetration of abuse. So, for example, the offender that I had handled that case for a bit, where he would play video games with youths and then he would accidentally slip into their clothes at that point. And sometimes it would be more explicit, but sometimes it was more subtle. The last phase. And this is particularly relevant to the disclosure piece. The last phase is they're going to want to, they're obviously going to discredit the victim. So you see up here the he said, she said, right? one of my least favorite phrases in the English language. Very often, one of my frustrations as a prosecutor is when an investigator would there'd be a forensic interview of a child, which is good, and then they would get a statement from a perpetrator, and then they'd hold up both CDs and say, it's a real he said, she said. Well, if those are the only people you talk to, then sure it is. That's where you need to start doing an investigation. And so there's always corroborative evidence in these types of investigations. But regardless, the goal of the perpetrator is to minimize the existence of that evidence, minimize the effect of that evidence. And so all those earlier grooming stages, as I said, they're leveraging those. So they're going to try to show the victim is just untrustworthy. Look, they don't even have any friends. Look how isolated they are, right? That's by design. What about the family? Oh, can you believe anybody from that family? They've got all these substance abuse issues. CPS is out to their house all the time. They're just a total mess. Well, yeah, that's by design. That's because you're leveraging the targeting stage there, right? And of course, ultimately, they'll always paint themselves as the real victim. Recall the offender who had talked about, this 3-year-old was just so flirtatious. There was one perpetrator who raped his daughter, and then told her, "Why are you such a whore that you make me do this?" And then would make her pray for forgiveness. So that discrediting can look like a lot of different things. We need to be aware of that, and we shouldn't be surprised at the effects that can have on a child. Lastly, we need to be aware that abusers are just as good at grooming allies as they are at grooming victims. I already talked about this quote from a convicted child molester who said he considered church people easy to fool. They have a trust that comes from being Christians. They tend to be better folks all around. They seem to want to believe in the good that exists in people. I think they want to believe in people, and because of that, you can easily convince with or without convincing words. So with all that as pretext, let's step into some of the internal narratives. And all of these are things that I've directly heard in one form or another from survivors, either survivors who are children that I've worked with through the judicial system, or as adult survivors reflecting back on these dynamics. This right here, the quote, "No one will believe me," that's probably the most common statement that I've encountered. And again, that's the whole point of the grooming stages. So let's step into a bit of an interactive segment. What is something we can do when a child is making a disclosure to us? What is something we can do that counters this dynamic? We know that children in many instances are thinking this, that no one will believe them. If a child does muster up the courage to tell us, what is something that we can do right there to counter this? And I'll refer you all to the chat on this point. If you could just weigh in, what's something you can do as a child makes a disclosure to you to counter the dynamic? In their minds, many of them are thinking, no one will believe me. What can you do in that interaction to address that? I'll give a couple seconds pause, and I'll let one of my esteemed colleagues summarize the chat.
Tell them you believe them. Reinforce. Don't ask anything like, "Are you sure?" But do actively listen. Explain. Oop, they're going quickly. "I believe you. I believe you." Always take time to listen. Set aside a quiet and safe space to talk to the child. Listen and protect. Give the child time to talk and believe.
Fantastic. Yeah, all those. I think my work here is done. All right. Yeah, the one of my frequent co-presenters, Amber Higgins, who works with the Mon County Child Advocacy Center, also one of the key figures in the SHIELD Task Force as well. She talks about how when she initially came forward as a child, no one did believe her. And then 10 years later, she went to a state trooper who told her in this process, "I believe you." And she remembers thinking it was the first time she heard that 10 years later. Don't let that be the case with a child who comes to you. Don't let that be the case. It's incredibly difficult to come forward. The overwhelming majority of child abuse allegations are correct. Only between 2 and 8% of child abuse allegations are false. And typically those aren't coming from children. The overwhelming evidence suggests that the child is telling the truth. And regardless, it's not your job, right? You're not the investigator. You probably don't want to be the investigator. You're not the prosecutor who has to make those charging decisions. Just offer empathetic support for that child. I love one of the comments that talked about the active listening, right? Not delving into it, not even minimizing it. And it doesn't. I like the other comment about, well, are you sure? right? Even if you're saying, you know, to you it might be like, well, I didn't say I'm not believing them, right? But even asking those questions, you're confirming the child's worst fears, right? If you're even getting into that questioning space, and there's no need for that. It's probably not within your job description, and regardless, it can be extremely damaging to the child. So yes, great answers on that. We can immediately offer unconditional, empathetic listening and support and say we believe them. Let's talk a little bit about another dynamic, and we'll go back to Diane Langberg for this.
Victims of abuse almost always feel shame. One of the reasons is that if it occurs to a child, any of us who have raised children know that they're quite egocentric. They think they're the center of the universe. And that's why a child, for example, whose parents are divorcing might think, Mommy and Daddy are getting a divorce, and if I'd been a good little boy, they would still be together. That's child thinking. And so the abuse is being processed by the child. And so the abuse is happening to me because I'm bad. And sometimes actually abusers will use that and tell the child, you know, grandfather is doing this to you because you're bad and evil and you're making me do this bad thing. And so the shame of being a bad person is part of what they carry. It literally becomes their central identity.
Yeah, and this is another horrible dynamic that I've encountered in my cases as well. You know, even with young children, things like I feel dirty, maybe I deserved it, or of course a lot of this is a lot of things we as a society layer on top, right? Like, well, what were you wearing? What were you drinking? Things like that. One of the other sources of shame that I've seen, and I've seen this particularly with male survivors, though I don't think it's specific to them. Certainly it could apply across genders, but it felt good. Children are not, you're not equipped to understand that there are certain physiological, that your body has normal physiological reactions to sexual touch. And so how do you respond? How do you respond when this touch occurs to you and yet it feels good? It just adds to that guilt and that shame dynamic. You feel more responsible for it. You feel more involved in it. And so it creates just a ton of issues for you to navigate. They're just far too complex to do so, especially at an early age. So something to remember, we're not the child's counselor typically, right? And so we don't want to engage in therapy. But with that said, is there something we could do, just as a child discloses abuse, if we're sensing those sort of guilt and shame dynamics, what's something we could do to interact with this in a way that combats that guilt and shame narrative? Is there anything we could do, again, without delving into therapy, that might be helpful? That might be helpful in that way. Let's go back to the chat and see what you all think. How can we combat that guilt and shame narrative during an abuse disclosure? And keep in mind, we're not talking about forensic interviews either. We're just talking about your initial interaction with the child.
But somebody say, this is not your fault. That just came through twice. Reassure them that it's not their fault and just listen and allow them support. It's not our fault. You didn't do anything wrong. Reassure the child that you believe them. Don't act shocked with whatever they say.
Yep.
And that's,
yeah. So we're dealing with an educated audience, clearly. Hopefully some of this is new to some of you. But yeah, these are great responses. Just affirming that it's not their fault. That can be in a critical. You can just sort of see those of you who have had those conversations. You can almost visually see the weight lifted sometimes, and it's so critical. I like also the comment about not looking shocked. if you're shocked by the acts, remember what Diane Langberg said earlier about children are egocentric. They interpret things about them. You're reinforcing that what happened was bad and that they are bad, right? It's hard for children of some developmental stages to distinguish between those two. So you're just going to have a poker face and just react to it and just nod and be affirming, regardless of what terrible disclosures made. Even if it's something that strikes you as bizarre, don't react with shock or disbelief or horror. Just stay level, stay pleasant, stay in that moment with the child. Great input on that. Thank you. Another myth, it's something that just happened to me. This is a lie that abusers will often tell. So you often see that it's particularly insidious with like sibling abuse, where a perpetrator will tell one child that, hey, it's just you, and if you don't engage in this, or if you tell, then I'll start doing it to your younger brother or sister, and then they find out years later that actually they were assaulting both. So that's certainly another thing that deals with, and that goes to that sense of isolation as well. Of course, fear. Fear can be a big piece of it. Not wanting to break up the family, and with the majority, there was a West Virginia the West Virginia Child Advocacy Network collects statistics just on the thousands of children that go through West Virginia's CACs every year, and the overwhelming majority of children know their perpetrator. I want to say it was around 90% at the last report in 2018 that I've seen anyway, and the majority of perpetrators were some sort of caregiving figure, either a parent or a step parent or mom's boyfriend or things like that. And so often there is a breakup of the family as the result of it. It's a very real fear. We already talked about I'm protecting my brother or sister or cousin, not wanting to lose friends. This is something we talk about a bit in the SHIELD assemblies when it comes to the bystander effect, knowing that your friend's going through something but not wanting to tell because you're worried about what that'll do with the relationship. Of course, children generally love their perpetrators. They're a member of the family. They love them. They just want them to stop sexually assaulting them. All right, so let's delve into some practical disclosures. We've got a couple hypotheticals to go through, just a few more preliminary thoughts. I already talked about the importance, very briefly, about the importance of anatomically correct terms for abuse detection and abuse prevention. So abuse detection, I've heard a couple stories where a child has told a teacher or another adult, my uncle ate my cookie. Well, that doesn't necessarily sound problematic. It just sounds like she's mad that uncle ate my cookie, and then you find out months later that was actually describing an act of sexual abuse. And so you have that initial period of time where abuse continues because the child didn't have that vocabulary that triggered concern on part of the adult. Or you see things like so-and-so played with my monkey or my purse and things like that might be innocuous on the surface level but are not. So that has implications, of course, for abuse detection and then also abuse prevention. Remember, perpetrators are tending to try to target children who are more naive. So we've got to be focused on that anatomically correct language just to deter. Certainly it's not the child's responsibility, but any time we can build in those preventative factors, that's going to be important. A couple of quick distinctions here, and I've been hinting at them throughout. There's a huge difference between a forensic interview and a minimum facts interview. And unless you're a forensic interviewer, you need to be doing a minimum facts interview. A forensic interviewer, as you see, is conducted by a trained forensic interviewer following an established protocol in a controlled environment. So that's a longer interview. They're really delving into detailed information, and that's going to form the basis of the abuse investigation and prosecution. That is not what you want to do. And if you attempt that without the correct training or even in the wrong environment, that can be disastrous. What you want to be doing is a minimum facts interview. So it's just a few simple, broad questions. You got to obtain some basic information so you know how to report it. And you definitely want to avoid any sort of leading or suggestive questions that could really destroy criminal investigations and could lead to some really bad long-term effects for that child when justice is unable to be obtained, not because you did anything malicious, but just because you didn't know how to handle that process, and it taints the evidence collection. So when you report, what will DHHR ask for? This is taken from their website. These are the type of things you need to find out through either through the process of the disclosure itself when a child's disclosing to you, or as you can see, a lot of these you're already going to know potentially. For example, the location of the victim and caregivers, or you're able to access it from your school office, for example. So you don't necessarily need to ask, Johnny, who's 5 years old, what's your street address? You can get that elsewhere. You just need to be able to get it. Demographic information, what general type of abuse or neglect is suspected? Does it seem like there's imminent danger of continuing abuse or neglect? Or is this something that's been disclosed in the past? Is there a protective caregiver, or does it seem like that's not the case? Does the perpetrator still have access to the victim? That's critical. And then, of course, safety threats. If the child's talking about guns and things like that, that would be a very good thing to include in your report. Remember, when you're talking with children, we don't want to unintentionally reinforce perpetrator messaging. So again, avoiding any sort of statements that might cast aspersions on a child's worth or behavior. We don't want to engage in any sort of manipulation, try to manipulate a child into saying what we want them to say or feel they need to say. That can be extremely dangerous for a variety of reasons. Certainly, we don't want to be coercive. You need to tell right now or else. And I think also overpromising, right? I think all of us want to be, and this extends to me when I was a prosecutor, we all want to say, like, look, from here on out, nothing bad's going to happen. You're totally safe now, guaranteed, and sadly we can't. And even as a prosecutor, and that was the point where I had the most quote unquote power in cases, even then I couldn't guarantee outcomes. I couldn't control what a judge would do. I couldn't control if they set bond conditions pathetically low. I couldn't control jury decisions and things like that. And if I promise a child that I can, then I've just lost credibility. And I've lost my ability to have an honest and authentic communication and relationship with that child. So as tempting as it's going to be, you can't do that. What you can say is, I'm here, I see you, I'm here for you, things like that. But you definitely don't want to overpromise, even though you'll want to. Couple do's, and a lot of you were touching on these earlier. Say, I thank you. I believe you. It wasn't your fault. I'm glad you're talking with me. I'm sorry this happened to you. How can I help? Affirm that they're talking about it. That's a great thing because they feel guilt about that often, reminding them they're not at fault. Look for language that upsets the child. I was second chair on an abuse case, and I was working with a more seasoned prosecutor, and he and we were talking with a victim of childhood sexual assault, and the prosecutor kept using the phrase "your dad, your dad, your dad" to refer to the perpetrator, and you could see every time he said it, the child winced, and you could just see the distaste and the revulsion for that. And so be aware for things like that upset the child, and don't do them. And certainly affirming their value and listening throughout. You obviously don't want to blame the child, rally around the offender, ask leading or suggestive questions. Definitely never want to suggest a perpetrator. That's probably about one of the worst things you could do from a criminal investigation standpoint. You don't want to immediately attack the offender. You probably want to, depending on what's disclosed to you. But remember, again, that's someone that the child loves probably in most cases. And so you're going to want to resist that impulse. Avoid asking for details of the abuse itself. Again, you're just getting at that general category. Once you have a general sense of, is it sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, etc., that's all that's needed for the DHHR report. And if the child volunteers more, don't stop them. But you don't want to be probing or asking for details of that. That can create a lot of issues when you get on down the line. Don't assume you know what happened. Certainly don't silence the child. Don't show shame or discomfort about body parts, certainly. One of the more damaging things is offering cliches. Throwing out things like, oh, well, God has a plan for this, the fact that you were raped for years by your father, God has a plan for it. Regardless of your religious beliefs, those types of extended discussions, that's probably appropriate for a therapeutic context, or maybe a relationship, maybe a trauma-informed individual who can talk through a lot of the spiritual questions that children definitely do have. There was a recent study by the Dallas Children's Advocacy Center, and a majority of children struggle with those spiritual questions surrounding abuse. Where Where was God when this happened? Why did God let it happen? If God's so powerful, things like that. Those are very valid questions to explore, and I don't want to minimize that at all. And faith certainly has a role in developing resilience and support. But those are difficult questions, and they're just that, questions, right? Questions to explore. And so just offering pat answers and cliches can be extremely harmful and difficult, and in many cases destroy a child's faith. And there are a variety of, I could give a couple workshops on that alone, unfortunately, but certainly avoid cliches. They might make you feel better as you try to rationalize how this occurred, but they don't make the child feel better, and they're not conducive to a child's healing. Well-meaning but harmful statements. I know how you feel. You're lucky that this horrible worst thing didn't happen. That's a terrible thing to say. Minimizing the abuse itself. Oh, you'll get over it, or even worse, get over it. Don't worry, it's going to be all right. It might not. Out of tragedies, good things happen. Time heals all wounds. Forgive and move on. Again, certainly a loaded question that needs to be explored in a trauma-informed way in both a therapeutic context and a spiritual context if the child is willing, but not something to just throw out there or mandate immediately. That again can be incredibly damaging. All right, so in our remaining time, let's work through a couple hypotheticals. And you all have been phenomenal in the chat so far, so I'm sure that trend will continue. Let's start with this hypothetical. We'll hopefully get through a couple, and then we'll end with some Q&A. So our first one, Susie, a young child in your class, tells you that Melissa's cousin is touching her private parts. So Susie, a young child in your class, tells you that Melissa's cousin is touching her private parts. Melissa's cousin is touching Melissa's private parts. So what do you do? What's your initial reaction? What do you do? How soon do you do it? And let's hold off on the dynamics since we're in a chat forum. If we were face to face, we could have this lengthy discussion, but maybe let's limit the questions for the chat. What do you do? What are your initial steps when Susie tells you this? And I'll open it up for the chat.
I'll let you know when I see something, Peter.
Perfect.
Thank her for telling you. Speak privately. Thank you for trusting me to share this.
Yeah.
Ask them if they want to go sorry, now they're coming in. Tell her you believe her, listen to her. Thank her for telling me. Ask her if she would like to talk about it. Thank the child for letting you know. Make a report to CPS. Do not approach the perpetrator.
Yeah. My work here is done again, right? All those things, those empathetic initial responses. I like, would you like to talk about it? I think that's a nice open-ended prompt. It's not leading, it's not suggestive. It's not saying let's have a full forensic interview, but it's just a broad question so you can get a grasp on what's going on. And then critically report, right? Let's assume, so even though this is just a disclosure of another child, if you have a reasonable suspicion of abuse or neglect under the West Virginia Code, have to report that. So definitely need to call CPS. You also probably need to report to your chain of command as well. But it's critical that you report within 24 hours to CPS as well. Simply reporting up the chain does not satisfy the law. Used to, it doesn't now. Well, arguably it used to. That's a debate. But as of right now, from the moment you have a reasonable suspicion of abuse or neglect, you have to contact CPS directly. Also contact your chain, if it's your chain of command or your organizational structure. And then if it's quote serious physical abuse or sexual abuse, you also have to contact law enforcement. So if you don't know who the relevant agency is, call 911. And depending on where you're at, maybe it's city police, maybe it's sheriff's department. It's always can be state police as well. So yeah, I need to do those three things. Another point here is some people think, well, what's a reasonable suspicion? Do I need to wait for more evidence just based on this disclosure? And the answer is no. I mean, again, you're going to want to collect that additional information that DHHR wants in order for you to make that report that they're able to process. But a child's disclosure alone, just the statement, hey, Melissa's cousin's touching her private parts, you now have a reasonable suspicion. Okay, there's no wiggle room on do I think this specific statement is reasonable. That's a clear disclosure. It needs to be reported. It's reasonable suspicion. Great. Well, let's just in the interest of time, let's jump to another one. All right. So let's change our hypothetical slightly. Instead of that, Susie told you only that Melissa had a secret and Melissa is too scared to talk about it. So for the chat, do you confront Melissa, and what questions do you ask her? Do you confront Melissa, and what questions do you ask her, if so? We don't have that detailed description of what occurred. We just know that Melissa had a secret and she's too scared to talk about it.
I will read it as soon as I see one.
Great.
Thank you for sharing. Can you share more so we can get Melissa help? Ask Melissa if she wants to talk. My job is to listen. Do not force her to talk or ask leading questions. If there is a counselor at the school, ensure that Melissa is sent to her.
Yeah, great suggestions all around. I like how I like the one answer in particular where asking, expressing the affirmation, but then asking, can you share more? Because maybe, and the respondent probably knows this, maybe Melissa did tell Susie the secret, but Susie feels that she can't tell you, that would be violating some sort of trust, right? So pushing that a little bit in a gentle way, I think that's a wise question, just to see if Susie does know the secret, especially if Melissa refuses to say anything. That might be the only way you find out about it. And so, yeah, I like that response. I think in this scenario, certainly confronting Melissa is okay if you have a relationship with her. I like the direction of the school counselor as well. You need a bit more information. Just a secret that she's too scared to talk about. You need a bit more information. Certainly you need to avoid, I think someone mentioned this, avoid any sort of leading or suggestive questions. Susie told me you have a secret that you're too scared to talk about. Are you comfortable talking about that? Or tell me more about that. You're always safe. The best question you can ask in any of these scenarios, and this includes in forensic interviewing, is tell me more about that, right? Nice, open-ended. You're not suggesting anything. You're not narrowing the scope of what a child wants to talk about. Just tell me more about that. I would have, well, it depends on, we'll skip over that for a second. Again, I think someone had said either in response to this hypo or a previous one, this needs to be in a private place. You can't be having this discussion out in public in front of the child's peers and all that, and adding that stigma onto things. This really needs to be something that's done with sensitivity. Let's do one more. Derek tells you that his mom's boyfriend touched his bad spot, but Derek shot him with a gun and he's dead now. You know that the boyfriend is alive. So you know that Derek was not, that account is not accurate. Derek did not, in fact, shoot him with a gun, though he said he was. You know that the boyfriend is still alive. In the interest of time, I'll answer the first one, what dynamics are likely to be present. In some abuse cases, I've seen these with a couple males and a couple, I guess I've seen it across genders, but you see sometimes a bit of a revenge narrative that can have more fantastical elements, and it's a way of the child sort of taking back control. They were victimized in this context, and so they add this fantastical element of I shot him in the face, or I kicked him in the head, or I jumped out of the tree and beat him up, and just things like that. Again, that's something that does happen. It doesn't discredit the rest of the narrative. And I've seen just some terrible cases that were sort of initially discounted because of that, because there was a revenge narrative present or some fantastical elements. There's often reasons why those fantastical elements exist, and the child very well may be giving an accurate abuse disclosure, just there are some additional elements thrown in. So based on this, but let's say based on this, I'll just summarize it. Based on this, yeah, even though there's some fantastical elements, some might say, oh, well, I don't really have a reasonable suspicion that abuse occurred here because, look, the child's saying this other outlandish thing that's not the case. I'm thinking of I've seen a case where a child was describing, that she was in the woods, and she was tied up, and she had, the perpetrator had a samurai sword, and all these intense dynamics, and I jumped out of a tree, and then one day she goes to school, and says, hey, there's a dead body in the home. And they actually do look into that, and it turns out there was a dead body in the home. Mom's drug dealer had overdosed in the bathroom. The child had to use the restroom, so the mom rolls the dead body into the bathtub, says, come on in, sweetie. Child uses the restroom, sees the dead body in the bathtub. And then at that point, everyone sort of scratches their head and says, maybe we should look into all these sexual assault allegations as well. And they were accurate also. Again, with some additional fantastical elements, but it makes sense. So again, don't put yourself in a position of determining what is or isn't reasonable. If it's an abuse disclosure, it needs to be reported to CPS. If it's serious physical or any kind of sexual abuse, it needs to be reported to law enforcement as well as CPS, and then it needs to be reported to your administration as well. And all that needs to be done within 24 hours. So I have a couple additional things I'll go through really quickly, and we'll still have some time for question and answer. For a couple resources to point you to, I really like this app, the Child Protector app. It's particularly useful more for physical abuse type cases. It goes through like injuries and whether they're suggestive of accidental or non-accidental trauma. I thought it was helpful just as a prosecutor, and so you might find that helpful as well. Maybe less relevant in sexual assault cases, but I think in physical cases it was pretty helpful, especially with young kids. COVID-19 resources. There are some great organizations putting out a ton of good stuff. I know our local organizations in West Virginia, the West Virginia Foundation for Rape and Information Services, the Center for Children's Justice, and all of you are doing some amazing work just in the era of COVID-19. I love how West Virginia has really answered the call and just the need of the moment. So very encouraged by that. This is another resource, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, APSAC. They have some COVID-19 resources. Also, the Academy on Violence and Abuse, AVA, they have global resources as well. I like this one. This is free resilience resources for children. So you can see there, resilience for children and families, protective factors during COVID-19. They have some worksheets and things like that that can be helpful. Had a role in this. The SHIELD Task Force, in partnership with Libera, put together 4 videos for wellness, body safety, and online safety for both elementary and middle and high school students during the pandemic. And so these are all tailored specifically to children. Again, as I said, elementary children and then middle and high school children. So it's 2 modules each. One focuses on online safety, one on wellness and body safety. And you can just go to YouTube or shieldwv.com. We have a tab under resources. Go to Shield Videos, so shieldwv.com. You can access those. And I know we talked a little bit about like body safety today. And if you're uncomfortable, like how do I even have that discussion with my kids or kids I know? That's an awkward topic when you're dealing with young kids, or maybe even more so with older kids. Those videos show you how to do that. They're directed directly towards kids. So you can watch them with your kids, send them to others, or just watch them and understand how you could approach that topic in a great way. There's also resources for kids. We know that crisis text lines have skyrocketed. I think it was RAIN, the national organization, that said that the majority, I think, of their hotline calls since the beginning of the pandemic have been from kids, which I don't believe was the case pre-pandemic. But there are a couple text hotline. You can see the crisis text line that's oriented more towards kids. There's the child help hotline as well. There are a couple things that are available for kids as well. So we want to be proactive, obviously, equipping kids with these resources in advance also. And again, you will have a PDF of all these slides, so don't feel the need to feverishly write it all down. If you have more questions about reporting, we just covered a couple pieces of that today. SHIELD has reporting FAQs on our website. So again, go to shieldwv.com. We've got an FAQ tab, and you can access these. And so it's 19 different questions. These are just a couple of them. We've got a couple paragraph response for each of these that can guide you through what this looks like with more specificity. It's tailored to West Virginia law. So we developed it here, had a great response from other organizations that have actually integrated into their curriculum, which we're excited about. So at this point, I think I'll direct it over for question and answer. Thank you all for your interest in this topic. I think it's more, I don't think it is, it's more important now than perhaps ever before. We know that kids are increasingly isolated. We know that they have less contact with mandated reporters. So it's more important now than ever to respond with excellence to any reasonable suspicion of abuse or neglect and to be proactive. And so teachers, especially and school personnel, you're on the front line. There was a study by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that 52% of confirmed cases of child abuse were identified by teachers and school personnel, 52%. So the odds are better than average that if you don't notice and identify and report abuse, that no one will. So it's a great responsibility, but a great privilege as well to be there when the child trusts you. Thank you. Melody?
So this is your opportunity to put questions in the question and answer box. I did have somebody that asked, is it okay to ask, will this person be home when you get home? And that popped up a couple of different times, Robert.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. So again, you're going back to that category. You're defining whether or not there's imminent danger and whether the perpetrator still has access to the child. That's critical information for DHHR or law enforcement to prioritize that report up to the top of the list. So yeah, I think that's a reasonable question. And I think now what's important here is if the child raises the name and identifies the perpetrator, that's fine. What's critical to avoid is you raising a name. Like if you have a suspicion, and maybe you have a well-founded suspicion that it's, stepdad or something like that. If you introduce that can be really, really, really problematic. But if the child raises it, says, so-and-so does this, you can then ask, oh, well, where does so-and-so live? How often do you see so-and-so? And things like that. I think those are fair game to establish that imminent danger. So great question. Great question.
If a student writes the details, will CPS accept it?
That's a great question. So I have to follow my own advice here, right? Don't overpromise. There are some saints who work in child protection. I have a ton of respect for Rebecca Carson, who runs a centralized intake for JHR. There are just some wonderful, wonderful people who just work thankless, long hours and do some great work. With that said, it's hard to predict it. I am really impressed by centralized intake and how they process the reports. They've gotten a lot better over the years. Just in my anecdotal experience, I think they've been faster. But it depends. If a child is giving if a child is giving details of abuse, of physical or sexual abuse or neglect, then that should be accepted for referral, and it should go to a specific the county, the appropriate geographic county, and be accepted for investigation. Should. Does it always? I can't say that. I think it varies county. I know it varies county to county. I've worked directly or indirectly with 6 or 7 counties in West Virginia, and their efficacy in processing reports varied from county to county. Some were fantastic, some it took a while. I know for a while there was a huge backlog in one of the counties I worked in. I do know that their CPS staffing statewide has gone up a bit. I would love to see it go up a lot more, frankly. We're still well below the national average. The national average says you should only work 25-ish, like 15 to 25 cases, and be competent as a social worker, as a child protection professional. And I know for a fact that there have been social workers in West Virginia that have worked over 150 at a time. And you can be an absolute rock star, and some of them definitely are, and still just not be effective with that amount. So the answer is hopefully and probably, and it depends. But regardless, I do think that's not, let me back up a little bit. I wouldn't encourage the child to write it down. If the child asks, can I write it down? Sure. But again, I wouldn't put the child in a position of writing it down. There are pros and cons to that. That I probably don't have time to get into. I'll give you a quick example. So if the child just writes some quick details, and then later on it makes a lot more broad disclosure in an extended forensic interview, for example, or maybe through therapy, then a defense attorney is going to say, well, look at this, it was this tiny little thing, and now look, it's blown up everywhere, right? Now, that might be totally invalid, and as a prosecutor, I'm comfortable fighting back against that because, you didn't demand that you write down absolutely everything in horrifying detail, right? We can make those arguments. I just say that to say there's pros and cons of writing it down. On the pro side, this is something that shows that the child's this was the child's recollection at this point early on in the investigation. So there's a pro side to it as well. It's a piece of evidence I would certainly be interested in as a prosecutor. I'm rambling a bit, but the takeaway is don't tell them to write it down. It might be useful. It might create issues, and it should be accepted for referral if it meets the statutory definitions of abuse and neglect.
Okay, I'm going to give two more, and this comes up to me a lot. Somebody asked if you could give examples of broad questions, that idea of open-ended questions, Robert, to respond to a child.
Yeah, the classic one in forensic interviews is tell me more about that. There's I don't have it right in front of me, but if you Google first response, FIRST, first response, it's by Zero Abuse Project, my employer. First response is specifically training for you. It's not forensic interview training, though Zero Abuse Project also has the Child First forensic interviewing protocol, but it walks you through step by step. It's an acronym, FIRST, FIRST. It walks you through how to respond to a child's disclosure in detail. In general, ask WH questions. When, where, what, why, maybe not why, but generally those WH questions are useful, just to keep it very broad, because, if you were asking, like a leading question would be like, did, maybe avoid the dids. Did this happen? Did this happen? You don't want to do that. A leading or a suggestive question is one that suggests a response, right? So if a child can answer simply yes or no, then that's probably a question to stay away from. And I'm generalizing big time. They're appropriate yes or no questions, but just trying to give some general pointers. I think where, when, just things like that or WH questions are useful. And if you want more information, I would look into the first response protocol by Zero Abuse Project. We do offer training on that, incidentally, and it can give you a lot more input on that. I do think in general, if you're stuck, you can say things like what happened next, or tell me more about that. But again, with the minimum facts interview, you're not trying to drill down, right? You're not even trying to get a big expansive picture. Once you have like a general type of abuse disclosure, so-and-so touched my bad spot or so-and-so touched my pee-pee, then you're not really interested in trying to delve out the details of that. So at that point you could ask, well, when did that, I'm sorry, thank you for telling me, and express your belief for the child, and then ask, when did that happen and maybe where? And just sort of establishing those categories that DHHR needs on that one slide. And then once you have that, thank the child, back out, and that's that. You don't want to go too deep into the abuse disclosure, just in your initial discussion with the child.
Okay, to wrap it up, I'm going to do a combination because these are two that we hear all the time. First of all, and I'm going to put it together and then you can answer both of them. One was pertaining to when a school personnel person suspects or knows that a child is using drugs, do they have to report that to CPS? So that's one. And then the second part is, what is West Virginia's criteria for CPS investigation when the report is drug use in the home if details of how this affects the child is not known? So 2 layers, and I get those both a lot. And then we'll wrap it at then. If anybody else has questions, they're free to email them and I'll make sure that those get to you.
Yeah, so it's complicated for both of those. Substance abuse, the question is really, oftentimes the question that they're going to be looking at in an investigation on the criminal investigation side is, does the child have access to it? I've seen some internal debates that have varied on the type of substance and things like that. ultimately, that should certainly be reported. If there's substance abuse in the home, that should be reported. In terms of the specific criteria, there's a catch-all category for sort of any condition that threatens the health, welfare, or safety of a child. I would argue substance abuse in the home certainly meets that threshold. So that's, I forget the exact code section, maybe it's in chapter 49 somewhere. But so if it threatens the health, safety, or welfare of a child, report it. Would be my general guideline. And then at that point, there's going to be an investigation both on the CPS side and on the criminal investigation side, if it gets referred there, as it should. And I imagine it is, to determine, okay, do the kids have access to the substances? How old are the kids? What type of substances are there? So, for example, is this something where mom is smoking weed in the bedroom, or are they cutting up cocaine on digital scales at the kitchen table, and you have toddlers walking up and things like that. So I say that not to say either one is okay, but I say that to say that they're going to view that very differently, right, in terms of how they prioritize and respond to those reports. But generally speaking, it would be my personal position, not speaking for DHHR, it would be my personal position that if there's substance abuse in the home, it constitutes, with the direct quote from the statute would be, it constitutes, quote, any other condition that threatens the health, safety, or welfare of children. And so I would report that whether it's the juvenile using or whether it's the parents using, and then that'll be responded to in different ways. So if it's just the juvenile using and perhaps he's incorrigible and parents are making appropriate efforts and whatnot, well, maybe at that point it just needs to become a referral petition to the prosecutor's office to make sure that this kid is getting treatment. That's the probable path. Maybe CPS will say, oh, well, it's not ours, but it gets bumped to law enforcement. Law enforcement refers it to the prosecutor's office and says, hey, there's no substance abuse going on in the home, but the juvenile is using substances. And so we recommend that you file, either a juvenile petition or start some sort of deferral process for the juvenile so you can make sure he receives at least outpatient treatment and maybe therapy, as the case may be. And then if it's in the home, if it's pervasive substance abuse in the home, then at that point it becomes more of a CPS issue, where they'll do a full investigation and determine the level of culpability of the parents. Maybe it's something where they can just do services without filing a full petition in the court system. Maybe they can just provide services, or maybe, for the more extreme example I gave, where you're cutting up cocaine on a digital scale in the kitchen, that needs to be a petition, obviously. So that's my rambling answer to that. Generally speaking, I would report substance abuse.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Peters. This is where we all thank you virtually for your time this morning. It's very much appreciated. Mr. Peters' contact information is still on the screen, so please write down his email address. If there are questions that we didn't get to or missed or that you have for him, I'm sure that he would be happy to answer them, or you can direct them to us. I want to once again just thank you so much for your time this morning. This is really important information, and thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Melody, and thanks to all our agencies and educators. Appreciate all you're doing for our kids. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, this is where we wrap up week 5, everybody, and we thank you so much for being a part of this webinar series. Reminder that you absolutely need to make sure that your name is on the sign-in sheet and evaluation. So if you have any trouble with that, please let us know. A reminder that Selena will be hanging on as soon as we close out here in a moment to answer any questions related to the graduate credit work and the assignments for today. We have mentioned to you in the past that we were planning to continue this training series. So I'm excited to tell you today that we have planned another 4 sessions, and we'll probably even take it further from there. Look for flyers to be emailed to everybody who is registered for this current training series later today. But just to give you a heads up, we will be keeping the same day and time. Next week, we will kick it off with Connections Matter, building protective factors to improve health and well-being in West Virginia. And Adolescent Health Coordinator Barb Tucker and Director for Prevent Child Abuse West Virginia, Jim McKay, will take the lead on that session. On July 1st, we will be doing Everyone's an Asset Builder, integrating developmental assets into your life. And I will be offering that presentation that morning. July 8th, we will have Jim Harris present on positive behavior supports, PBS, at home on July 8th. And then we will complete it on July 15th with Kathy Zaffron, the Executive Director of Mountain State Health Promise, talking about how we connect with foster care youth and talking about the Mountain Health Promise. So we hope that you will join us again for another 4 weeks. Look for that flyer to be emailed to you. Same day, same time. We thank you guys so much who have been with us since week 1 as we've worked out some of the kinks along the way. We appreciate all the feedback that you have provided to us. We appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules. Thank you so much. For those of you who are not hanging on board for the graduate course portion, have a good day. Thank you. Enjoy the beautiful weather that we've been having.
Melody.